This is part 3 of my series on Moran and the Lady Letty. Part 3 involves the production details used for publicity and answers the question, who did Rudolph Valentino push off the ship's rigging? Before getting into more of the production details about Moran and the Lady Letty, I'd like to point out a few interesting side notes. For example, George Melford, who had just finished directing The Sheik, had also already directed a sea tale in 1920 called The Sea Wolf, and Walter Long played a mate in that film, and of course he was in The Sheik as well. Now, the leading ladies that Rudolph Valentino was involved with at the time, Agnes Ayres in The Sheik, obviously, had already made a film called Cappy Ricks about a sea tale, and also Dorothy Dalton was going to be in another sea story after filming Moran and the Lady Letty. And the other interesting point here is that the male leads in these two films with Agnes Ayres and Dorothy Dalton had also been briefly considered to actually be the star of The Sheik. Even before the official premiere of The Sheik on November 6, 1921, there were little publicity squibs being dropped into the papers, and the first one I found was on November 1st, and this dealt with the rocking of the boat to do some of the scenes. Now, I have some details about this. I refer to the film. It's pretty interesting how they intercut scenes to achieve some of the visuals in the production. There were a couple of other squibs in November. There was one on November 13th, just after The Sheik opened up, and it said that Rudolph Valentino would be getting a dose of his own medicine after manhandling Agnes Ayres in The Sheik. And then one in December, the first mention really of seasickness, Dorothy Dalton declaring that she really didn't even care whether the picture was ever done because she was so seasick. Now, by January of 1922, the publicity campaign was really in full swing, and here's a picture from Exhibitors Herald, page 88, on January 28, 1922, with director George Melford and the two stars. In this piece, director George Melford was praised for being mindful of the necessity for economy in these times. And he did many, many rehearsals. He had fewer retakes. So with Moran and the Lady Letty, he did use less footage than what he had used to film The Sheik. Now, this piece of studio publicity is typical. It praises Rudolph Valentino for showing the robust qualities that are brought to the front in splendid effect, and also Dorothy Dalton, popular Paramount star, well, her portrayal is a revelation of art. Now, this paper in Canada ran the usual ad that you could see on the left, but also for some reason ran information that probably wasn't supposed to be seen by the public. They were instructions from the studio on how to exploit the picture. And the instructions read, quote, "If you have a house organ or desire to exploit the big Paramount picture Moran and the Lady Letty, use the following questions and answers in any way you may deem wise," unquote. And apparently the copy people just picked it up and ran with it. Now, these publicity pieces pale when compared to a spread that appeared in a paper in Kansas on April 7th, 1922. It was really an expanded version of the queries and replies ad that we saw just earlier, and it added fuller details and added 2 more players to the list of stars. And also, the film was described as a big Paramount super play, a stupendous production, and provided an unusually detailed synopsis of the story. However, the copywriter who picked up the studio information made an error when naming the cast. They, for example, called Walter Long Walter Miller, okay? And they also said that Rudolph Valentino was a star of an unusual supporting cast, including Dorothy Dalton and Walter, quote-unquote, Miller. Now, of course, the correct name was Walter Long. The writer seems to imply that everyone is in a supporting cast, And did he mean that it was an ensemble cast? Obviously, publicity material from the studio sometimes didn't quite make it into a publication intact or accurately. I've organized some of the more frequently used publicity themes I found to make it easier to get the gist of how interest was built for the film. One of the publicity angles that was used frequently in local papers involved the concept of Shanghaiing. The Ramon Laredo character experienced this at the start of the film. It set the scene for the entire film, actually. Great pains were taken to educate the public about what it meant to be Shanghaied. And the definition was repeated over and over again in many papers and almost verbatim in each occurrence. Along with the concept of being Shanghaied, the publicity revealed Valentino's feelings about his part and his career in general to this point. Now, although Valentino proclaimed that he liked it, some writers commented that Rudolph gets his, a reference to the rough handling of the leading lady in The Sheik, which was still playing around the country. Here's a quote about how Valentino felt about being Shanghaied in the film. Quote, "Such a trifle as being Shanghaied," observed Valentino during the screening of the picture, "means nothing in my life. I've been abused continually since I've been in pictures, shot and beaten up and generally mishandled, but I like it." Dorothy Dalton received a lot of attention, specifically about her hair. The standard publicity quote-unquote report about her hair stated that Miss Dalton had to cut a couple of inches off so that she could make up for the role, the mate on her father's ship, in many scenes, and the role is a primitive one, full of rough and tumble fighting and thrills. Now, in part 4 of my series on this film, it's already published. I do make reference to the brutal references to her hair in the reviews. It's almost unbelievable how brutal they actually were. Now, the many obstacles that the production encountered went beyond just the actual swells of the sea. The shoot was supposed to take 3 weeks at sea. It took 5 weeks. And part of the problem was that they had to tow the ships in and out to sea, to the location. And at the end, they only had about 4 hours to actually work and film. And Dorothy Dalton was very sick. She was constantly taking things to try to not be sick. So it was a very arduous shoot. And it was recognized by the local papers. They really commiserated with how difficult this shoot was. Now, there were problems on land too. It took about 2 weeks to build the 20 little buildings that were used to portray the little Mexican village at Magdalena Bay in the film. However, suddenly the roofs began to be destroyed. And the story of the hungry horses is quite interesting. It was a major problem, and they had to figure out what was destroying the roofs. They did, eventually. Extras were of interest, of course, and the scraggly-looking characters hanging around in the hotels during the shoot. Many people, old-timers in San Francisco, thought it looked like gold rush days. But of course, the big interest always was about the Chinese extras. And for some reason, some papers picked up the idea that Kinchel, the villain, was a Eurasian villain. I don't know why, but some people thought he was. But anyway, they said that the fighting that went on was so exciting, and the Chinese types took part most realistically. And apparently, after the scenes were shot, Miss Dalton was conducted through the mysterious and dark byways of the sleepy city by one of the admiring yellow men who had played in the picture. So, the racism was always there in the press at the time. The shoot even impacted some of the local school children. I found a couple of reports about how a few students saw the film company at the waterfront. The news spread, and a few students were missing from school. The next day, about 150 children were waiting to see the crew. According to the story, hooky on a large scale was the order of the day. When the teachers learned the facts, they joined the pupils, called a holiday, and there was general rejoicing. A good time was had by all. And now we get to the big question of who actually fell into the sea during the fight in the ship's rigging, which was the climax of the film and got lots of publicity. Now, there are many pieces talking about this scene, and some of them included a quote, a joint quote, according to the papers, by Rudolph Valentino as well as Walter Long. And it said that, quote, fighting on the foretop of a schooner with the vessel rolling and pitching and the mast swaying, it is no pleasant job, unquote. Now, the fight scenes were filmed very high above the ocean, about 60 feet above the deck, and the fight started on the deck, continued up to the rigging until they reached the foretop, and then they went out to the end of a spar, and a camera was lashed to another spar, and that's how they got a close-up view of the knockout punch, and the fall was obtained. This is according to one of the articles I found. Now here's a little squib from a paper with the headline, Rudolph and Long Stage Real Fight, and I quote from it. Quote, doubles were produced and began the fight with Rudolph and Walter standing in the wings watching. The audience, consisting of the two men, nudged each other, smiled, then looked disgusted, and after the fight between the doubles, advanced and asked permission to do it themselves. So now the question is, was that actually Walter Long as the evil Kitchell, losing the battle and finally dropping off the rigging into the sea to his death? No. Now, the double who fell into the sea was an athlete and actor named George O'Brien. According to the Los Angeles Times Hollywood Star Walk Project, O'Brien was born in San Francisco, where his father was chief of police. He became the Navy's Pacific Fleet light heavyweight boxing champion during World War I. After his discharge, he was introduced to the cowboy star Tom Mix, who helped him find work as an assistant cameraman, extra, and stuntman. And one of his early film tricks involved Rudolph Valentino knocking him from the rigging into the sea. Now, George O'Brien would go on to appear in one of the greatest of all silent films, Sunrise, a song of two humans, made in 1927 with Janet Gaynor, and he appeared in approximately 75 films over the course of his very long career. He was also known as, quote-unquote, the torso because of his physique, and worked with top stars. After the 1930s, he worked mostly in westerns and had a long connection to director John Ford. His last film was in 1964. And after his retirement from the screen, he directed and produced stage plays in Europe and the United States, and then became a scriptwriter for TV and movies. And I have a link to a very good post about him, more detail about his very interesting life. Now, as George O'Brien settled into a career in rough and tumble pictures, Rudolph Valentino would struggle with his image. After his triumphant performance in The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse and his elegance in Camille, the Sheik finally triggered the full-scale swooning of female fans, but questions about his screen persona were starting as he had been teased in his reviews of the Sheik for his theater barrow-wide eyes and over which turban was more attractive. As Emily Leader wrote in her book Dark Lover, she quotes a theater manager in Alabama who reported, the lady trade makes up for the men that stay at home. And she continues, the more girls and women lost their heads and hearts to Valentino, the more their dates, husbands, and fathers seized with resentment at the hypnotic actor showing them up. Now, aware of the problem, the studio cast Valentino in Moran of the Lady Letty to boost his appeal to the male audience by presenting him as an action star rather than simply a female heartthrob. But compared to the all-American Douglas Fairbanks, who had already delivered The Mark of Zorro in 1920, The Three Musketeers in 1921, and who was producing Robin Hood in 1922, Valentino's efforts in Moran of the Lady Letty, such as throwing some punches and climbing around rigging, certainly didn't turn him into a full-fledged action type. Reviews of the film, as you will see in the next post in this series, will show certainly this film did not herald Valentino as the next action hero. Valentino's image problem was compounded actually because while filming this role, he was being photographed in his off time in poses that would further damage and confuse his image. The famous fawn pictures taken under the guidance of Rambova, who turned up in San Francisco after she had gotten wind of his after-work escapades, apparently. Now, one of these pictures, which is not shown here because I haven't found it anywhere, and I don't know if it's public at all, one of these pictures showed Valentino curled up at Rambova's feet and would be introduced during the Gene Acker-Valentino divorce proceedings, which were going on in December 1921. And ultimately, the judgment would come down in January 1922, just before the premiere of Moran and the Lady Letty, although it wasn't the final judgment. I found a publicity spread from around the time of the premiere that showed many films that were coming out at the same time in a Los Angeles paper. It presented a picture of Valentino next to one of Grace Darmond. I think it's very ironic because Gene Acker, who had been involved in a tense love triangle with Darmond and Alla Nazimova, fled to Grace Darmond, her real love, after realizing she had made a mistake marrying Valentino in November 1919. Now, Grace Darmond testified during the divorce proceedings about, quote unquote, the bathroom incident, during which Valentino reportedly hit his wife. Darmond and Acker would stay together until 1925. But this was all swirling around as Moran and the Lady Letty was released. As Moran and the Lady Letty opened around the country, publicity started to surface about Valentino's next film. This was customary. As a big film came out, the next film by a star would start to be publicized in little dribs and drabs. On the same day, Moran and the Lady Letty premiered in Los Angeles on February 12, 1922, an example of the early publicity for Beyond the Rocks, which started production in late 1921 and continued during January 1922, appeared in the papers. And I found one little column here, and it revealed that actually the scene in the Louis XV garden at Versailles, that scene was actually made on the newly covered big stage at Lasky Studio. In the same column, Valentino's next film, Blood and Sand, which was already in production in February 1922, was also announced, and including having the incorrect name of the leading lady, which was not going to be May McAvoy. So, with all this going on, however, Moran and the Lady Letty was the main thrust, of course, of the publicity. And after the film was released, the reviews started coming in. And in the next post of this series, which is part 4, it's already published on my blog. We'll explore what the critics, theaters, managers, and Valentino himself thought of Moran and the Lady Letty in a new video, hopefully coming soon. As usual, I have some notes, and these are focused on the early seafaring films where cast members and the director of this film participated in before Moran and the Lady Letty appeared.